Hello friends, welcome to the REST API testing with TestCafe project. In this project, I will show you how to write easy yet effective API tests using TestCafe, so you can use TestCafe as a single framework for both UI and API testing, which is a great benefit because you can have just a single project using one framework to cover both UI and API tests, which greatly reduces complexity and maintenance of your code bases. This API we will be testing is this regress.io, which is a free public API, which can be used for testing, and also this airport gap API. Both websites contains a lot of endpoints, so we can cover all scenarios, including token authorizations. But first, let's go into code editor and set up our project. So let's start by opening terminal and type npm init with flag of yes, and this will again create our project package.json and submit all the default values. And after that we need to install TestCafe, and for that we can use the TestCafe bootstrap project. So you can type npx create TestCafe and hit enter, and this will provide us with some questions, and after that, if you submit everything, it will create your bootstrapped TestCafe project for you, including all important dependencies. So in this case, I'm gonna use JavaScript. Yes, I want to use tests as my folder path. And no, we don't need to create sample tests because we will create our own. And no, we don't want GitHub Actions right now. And now, as you can see, it's generating our project, creating files for us. So it might take some time, but now as you can see, it's success. Our TestCafe project has been created. And as you can see here, we have TestCafe RC, known modules, package.json, and of course, package.json contains our dependency, which is a TestCafe. Next, we need to create our tests folder. So let's go to the root of the project, new folder, and create a folder and name it tests. And inside that, we can create a new file, and we can name it test.js. And now we need to again start with creating our fixture. So in this case, I will name it API testing with TestCafe. And down below, let's create our first test. And in this first test, we will focus strictly on the status codes. So I'm going to show you how to actually call an API request using TestCafe and how we can validate if the response status is success or, for example, an error. So let's get a description. First, we can give it something like status code. Next, again, async t. And here I'm going to create a variable, and I'm going to give it a description of response because I would like to store the actual server response into this variable so we can later work with them, for example, inside assertions. And how we can create an API call using TestCafe, it's very simple. We call await t dot, and now we use request. And as a parameter for the request, we need to provide it with the URL. So now let's go to our browser. We can go here to the regress API. And if we scroll down here, we can see we have a list of the endpoints. So if, for example, I click here on this get single user, you can see that I can simply take this URL and paste it inside our request function, and after that we need to chain it with the actual API. So if we take this, so let's copy paste it. Oops, sorry. I would like to just take it. Oh, sorry, single user. Now I'm gonna take it and copy paste it right here. You can see that we will actually call and make just one slash. So the final version is regress.in/API/users/2. And if we call this using request function, it will actually return some response from the server. And what we can do is actually console log the response. So let's do console.log response. And now if we want to execute the test, we can simply go back to terminal. And as you can see, we have a hint here. It's npx TestCafe. And now you can just select the browser. It can be Chrome, or in this case, we can use Safari. It actually doesn't matter because we are using API tests, and hit enter. And now the test is being executed. And as you can see, our test passed, and we have console logged a lot of information here. As you can see, it's status code, it's status text, it brings headers, and also the body with the data. And since we are targeting the endpoint of users, and we are trying to get user number 2, it actually returns us all the data for the user number 2, or in this case with ID of 2. You can see it also here in the data body. And it brings us email, first name, last name, avatar, and also some support. But what we want to do here is to actually make sure that we got the status to 100. So I would like to assert that this request was successful. And for that, we can create simple assertion. So await t.expect. And we want to expect that the response status is equal to 100. And again, why 200? As you can see, status is here. And in HTTP requests, 200 means success. So our response was successfully get from the server. And now I can remove the console log because we no longer need it. And if I run the tests again, it will call this request and it will assert that the request was successful and we got status goes to 100. And why response.status? It's because we store the response into variable and name it response. Again, you can give it any name you want, but the common pattern is to use response. And then if we take a look at the response, we can see that it got a value of status. So that's why I use response.status, and I want to assert it that it equals to 100. As you can see, it should be to 100. So scroll down again and let's run our test again. And now, as you can see, our test is passing. And yeah, congratulations, you have created your first API test using TestCafe. And as you can see, writing requests is actually very simple. Don't worry, we will follow along in the course and it will be a little bit more complicated, for example, with post requests, sending data authorization, but the pattern and the framework of the code will always be the same. But let me now show you how does it look like if we call, for example, invalid response. So I'm gonna create a second variable and name it invalid response. And I'm gonna take again this request, but I will slightly modify the URL. So in this case, I will not try to target user by ID, but I'm gonna give it some nonsense, which I know it will fail. For example, I will try to get user with ID of invalid ID. I know this is not the valid integer, this is not any existing ID. So in this case, we should not get response to 100 because the request will not be successful. Well, technically it will be successful, it will bring some data, but the data will not be success, but it will be an error because user of invalid ID doesn't exist. So we can simply validate by await t.expect. And in this case, I'm targeting invalid response dot status equal. And right now, let's give it again 200 and see what's gonna happen. I'm gonna scroll down and run the tests again. And now you can see that our test actually failed. And you can see that we expected 404 to deeply equal 200. And what is the problem? You can see that we didn't get 200 because this request was invalid, and instead we get 404, which is not found. So this error means the user has been not found and our test failed. If you want this test to do correct assertions, so the correct way would be that if I call something invalid, which is not existent, I should always get 404. So in this case, if I update it to 404 and rerun the tests again, now the test should be correctly passing. And again, as you can see, our tests are passing. So let me clear the terminal and close it and quickly explain what we have just done here. So as you can see, we have called two requests. One was positive scenario and the second one was negative scenario because this API endpoint does not exist. In the first case of the correct API endpoint, we received the status code of 200, which means success and everything responded correctly. In the second case, we call invalid response, where we try to access something which is non-existing. In this case, it's user with ID invalid ID. And the server responded with error 404, which means this user was not found. So again, we need to modify the assertion. So we actually assert that our server is working correctly. And in the case of trying to target any invalid API, it should always respond with the 404 error. So that's all to the status codes, and let's now move on to the proper GET requests. Now let's continue with the second test, and now I will focus on the GET requests and asserting the actual values coming from the response. So down here, let's create a second test, and I'm gonna give it a description of GET request. And again, let's create async t. And now we will start the same. We will create the variable and name it response. And for these purposes, we can again use this request. So we will be targeting the single user, but now we will go beyond the response status and try to actually assert the values coming from the response body. So I'm gonna take it again. So we can paste it here. And first, of course, I need to find out which data are coming from the response. So again, I'm gonna do console.log response. And I'm gonna just give it the flag of only. So we will run only the GET request. Open terminal, run the test. And let's actually see what's coming into the console log. And again, we have all of this data. And what's interesting for us is beyond the status codes, of course, the body and the data inside. But before we actually do some assertions, we need to clarify one thing. As you can see now, I am just calling await t.request, and it always returns us a GET request because GET is a default value for the requests. But later we will try to do, for example, delete requests or post requests, so we will need to slightly modify it. But to keep everything organized, let's also do it for the GET request, so we will have everything aligned with all the design patterns we should be using. So instead of passing just the URL like this, I'm gonna delete it for now, and I'm gonna create the object because I will pass it the object of values. And the first value will be URL. And now I'm gonna just grab the URL and paste it. Oops, there should be this. After that, we need to provide it with the specific method. In this case, like I mentioned previously, we are calling a get, so we need to provide the method of get. And of course, we can put it some timeout for the request so it doesn't stuck and get infinite. In this case, we will just give it 10 seconds, just like this. And again, save it. And now, as you can see, now our request looks slightly better because we are passing some additional parameters in this object. So again, we are using the URL like previously. We are specifying the method. In this case, it's get. But remember, get is the default value, so you don't actually need to do it if you want to just get. But again, to make code much more readable, you should do it. So everyone who is looking at the code will automatically see that this method is using the get. Then we have some timeout. Again, this is optional, but it's nice to have it there. Then we actually console log the response. And right now, what we want to do is to assert some data coming from the body. So how can we actually do it? Again, we will start with await t.expect. And right now we will start with body data. So again, I need to chain it very similar like with the response. So I can do response dot body dot data dot id, and I can assert that the id is equal of 2. And basically what am I doing is I am chaining the object like you can see. So response, then we have body. Inside the body we have data. Oops, it's somehow automatically give it some incorrect ID. It should be data. And then we have ID. So again, response, body, data, and inside data we have ID, and the ID have value of 2. So now if I execute a test, it should be passing. But let's now actually try to assert some more. For example, we can assert that the first name contains the word or the name of Janet. So how to do it? Again, await t.expect, and we target response dot body dot data, and in this case we would target first underscore name, and we want to make sure it contains the name of Janet. So right now, if we execute a test, it will call this get request. Now it will console log response, which is optional, or technically we are using console log to validate what's coming from the server. But in real life, you will probably have some documentations where this will be all documented in your company documentation. So you don't need to actually console log it, but see it inside documentation. But if you don't have it, or you want to just to validate or see the data which are coming, you can always console log it. But for now, I'm just gonna comment this out because we no longer need some comments or console logs. And I'm just gonna execute a test and validate that from the response, we are getting the ID of 2 and the first name is Janet. So scroll down here and execute a test. And now, as you can see, our GET request is passing. So we can now modify it to actually see how does it look like when it fails. And we can modify the name Janet and write something like Peter. And execute the test again and see what's gonna happen. And now the test failed. And as you can see, it failed on the assertion error because it expects Janet to include Peter. So again, this way you can see what's gonna happen when your API test catches, for example, some bug or some issue, because you were expecting Peter based on the ID of 2, but the server sent you some data and the data was not correct and it sends you Janet. In this case, the test will fail and it will give you the assertion error, so you know on which line it fails and what actually failed. So now let's change it back to Janet. So the test is passing. We can also remove the console log because we no longer need that. And if we execute a test, it should be again correctly passing. So let's see, TestCafe is running. And the test is passing. One more thing, always when you create your assertions or asserting any APIs, you should always start with asserting the status response, like we have shown in the previous test. So just to keep everything design pattern organized, I'm gonna again put await t.expect. And here I will target response.status and make sure that I am getting to 100. So now, if you take a look, this is how a proper GET request test should look like. You are calling a GET request on this URL or this API endpoint. We are validating that the status response is 200. And then we actually selected some data from the response body. And we are validating that we are getting the ID of 2 and the first name of Janet. Again, you can write much more assertions. You can assert everything inside the response, or you can select something just like we shown here. It's up to you and up to your project and your requirements for your test. And if you want to practice a little bit more, for example, with this GET request, feel free to add one more assertion and try to, for example, validate the last name, or you can, for example, assert the response headers. Again, the pattern is the same. You always expect, you target the response. It can be status, body, or headers. You chain the data which you want and perform assertion. So let me remove the dot only and save it. And this is pretty much all for the GET requests. And now we can move to the POST requests, which will be slightly more difficult because we also need to send data on the server. And for that, we will be using headers, but more onto that later. So let's continue with the POST request. And for the POST, we will be using two scenarios. First will be positive, and the second one will be negative. And there is a very nice API for that. And if we scroll down here, you can see we have POST login successful and POST login unsuccessful. So in this case, we can test both of the POST API calls, and one will be successful and one will be unsuccessful. So you will be able to make a difference between them and see how actually assert the positive and assert the negative scenario. So let's take a look first on the positive. So let's click on the POST login successful. And you can see when we call the /API/login and we provide it with the correct email and password, we should get response 200 and of course this token. So the idea behind this test will be to actually call the request, pass it the correct data, validate the response status, and validate that the token contains the value which it's supposed to get. So let's go back and let's create one more test. And I'm gonna give it a description, POST request dash positive. And again, the start will be the same. We will create the response. And here await t.request. But now we need to provide a different URL and method, and maybe timeout can be the same. And also in this case, we will be providing with the body and the data, which can be seen in the API documentation. So first, let's start with the URL. And let's grab it. So it's /API/login. So we can actually copy it from here. And now just change to /API/login. Next, we gotta provide it with the method. And in this case, the method will be POST. Now, again, let's give it a timeout. It can be 10 seconds. And now here will be slightly different compared to GET request. You also need to provide it with a body. So I'm create a body, and body we'll give it email and password. So first value was email, and the second value was password. And it should be lower p. Just like this. So now let's go to documentation and actually grab the values. So we need to copy this value for the email first. And paste it inside email. And next do the same for the password. And that's it. This is how our post request will look like. So now it's time to create some assertions. So again, the same pattern, await t.expect. We want to get response.status. And we know, based on documentation, we are expecting the status 200. So equal 200. And now we also need to validate the token. So await t.expect response.body.token, and make sure it contains the value it should contain. And as you can see, I know it will be body token based on this documentation. So the value is token. So let's take it and paste it here. So now if we execute a test, so again, let's give it that only. So we execute only the post positive test, open terminal, execute a test. And you can see our post request is passing. So let me close it. And as you can see, there are some changes compared to typical GET request. In the post request, we again start with sending request with URL, method, the method needs to be post, there is an optional timeout, and the main difference is that we are actually sending the data on the server. So inside the body, we need to provide data which we want to send to the server. And after that, based on the data we send to the server, we get the response. Right now, we are sending the correct data based on the documentation. So the server returned 200, that everything was successful. And also inside the response body token, we have the correct value. So our login is pretty much successful. And in the next test, we will do the same, but we will try to provide it with the incorrect password or, for example, some missing data. And then the post request will actually get us an error, and also inside the body there will be some error message. So let's do it right now. So let's continue with the negative post request. So again, let's create new test, and I'm gonna create a description, post request negative. And what we can do here, we can actually take this whole request and we can copy and paste it and do slight modification, because again, we will be calling the request on the /API/login. Method will be post again. It will be same timeout, but in this case, I'm gonna remove the password. So we will only send email inside the body, and in this case, our login should actually fail. Also, if we take a look into documentation and take a look at login unsuccessful, you can see if you, for example, do not send the actually password, you will get response 400, so we will get an error, and the error message will be missing password. So let's test it out. So in this case, we also go down here and create assertion, so await t.expect. And in this case, we would like to take again response dot status to equal, and now it should be 400. Now let's assert that we actually get the error, which tells us we have missing password. So await t.expect. Again, response.body.error. Again, I'm following the documentation. If you, for example, don't have documentation, you can always console log the response and you will actually see all the values and attributes inside response. So it should contain, and let's actually copy and paste the error message. It should be missing password. So right now, if I again only run this test, we can test it out. So open terminal, again, npx TestCafe, for example, Safari, and execute the test. Now you can see our test is still passing. So let me close it. And again, what was the difference here? Basically, the response was the same. We did the request, we hit the API/login, we again used post method, but in this case, we slightly modified the body with data and we only sent the email without a password. And in this case, the login should obviously fail, which happened here, and we got the error 400 in the response status. And inside the response.body, we get an error which was containing missing password. So again, this is very simple, elegant way which you can actually test, for example, your login if you have a positive scenario and negative scenario. And next, we can take a look at how we can actually update data using put request. So let's create again one more test. And in this case, I'm going to create description put request. And well, the pattern will again be the same. So in this case, create const response. But in this case, we will actually call the request with the value with method of put. So first, let's give it URL. And if we again go back to documentation, we can see we have the update put here. And if we actually call the /API/user with some ID, which is valid, and we do use put and not get, and we send some data inside the body, we should get response 200, data should be changed, and also we should get updated at value, which basically tells us that the value has been updated at this time using put request. So let's go and create it. So we can take pretty much this URL, because we will try to update user number 2. Next, the method will be put. Again, let's add timeout, 10 seconds. This will be the same. And eventually in the future, you don't need to actually hard code the values for each timeout. You can pretty much create some config file where you store your values and just use it inside the timeout. So for the simple purposes, I'm just doing it like that. But again, you don't need to do it exactly. Like I said, you can, for example, the URLs can be included from some outside file or some Excel sheet. Again, there's a lot of options, but in the end, they all do the same. They just want to call some URL, and where do you actually store your URLs is up to you. Next, let's give it the body. And inside the body, we would like to follow the instructions from documentation and send the name and the job. So let's paste it here. And now if we actually execute it, we should get the 200 response status, and inside the body there should be value of updated add. And you can actually just assert that the updated add value is there, or if you want, you can also update, or not update, I mean assert the values. But again, this will be probably changing based on where you execute your test. So updating the date inside might not be a good idea. So let's go back. And now, again, same pattern, await t.expect. And first we start response.status to equal to 100. And next, we want to validate the response.body.updated@. And we can use OK. This basically tells us or asserts that the value updated at exists inside response.body. So save it. Again, let's run only this test. So I'm gonna open terminal. And npx TestCafe. Let's again use Safari. It actually doesn't matter again. And again, our test is passing. So this was a very simple way how you actually can call put request to actually update the data, how to write simple assertion. And now we have final one of those most common requests which you will do, and that is delete. So delete, again, very simple. This one will be very similar to the default get request. So let's create one more test again. Let's name it delete request. And here again we will start with const response, and we will call the request. And let's now take a look at documentation. If we scroll down here, you can see we have delete endpoint. And well, delete is fairly simple, like I mentioned before. Whenever you call delete on the specific user, you will just get 204 response, which means that the user has been deleted. So let's write a test for that. Again, we will start with the URL. And in this case, we can reuse the user number 2. Now the method will be delete. And the timeout will be again 10 seconds. So right now, all we need to do is just to execute this and assert that we get the response status. You don't need to put anybody or any data here. So it will be very fast and simple. Await t.expect. And we want to take response status. And it should be 204 based on the documentation. And right now I will try to execute all the tests, so you can see that if everything is still passing. So let's save it. Let's open terminal and now execute all our API tests. And as you can see, all of our tests passed. And since we are using a very nice description for our test, we have a very nice list of all the tests which all of respective requests which are being called. So right now it was fairly easy because this endpoint didn't require authentication. So right now I'm gonna show you how we can actually use authentication using tokens to access endpoints which are hidden or protected by authorization. So let's now take a look on the second API, because on this we cannot actually perform any authorization. So I'm gonna go here, airportgap.com, and as you can see, this is an API to fetch and save information about your favorite airports. And if you take a look here, API functionality available for testing, we can access HTTP method, and also we can access the HTTP token of the authentication. So first we need to actually create token. So on this website, go generate token, and here you can fill just some random address So I'm gonna give it some random123@mail.com and some password and create generate token. And now you can see your account information where you have your email and your authentication token. And this token we will be using for the header at the authentication. So first let's take it and copy and paste it inside the editor. So let's say I'm gonna create a variable here, or just comment it out, like this. And now I'm gonna create test and with the description, authentication, positive. Because we will also try to do the negative scenario. So again, we will start with the creating response. Okay, I have a small issue here. I forgot await the so const response await the it should be async. Sorry for a little confusion. And we start with the request, and again we will provide it with the URL, and in this case let me show you. So URL, and if we go back to the airport gap or click here to the API documentation, you can see if you go here to the get request on the favorites, you can see that you can also get the favorite from this endpoint, but it's authentication required. This means without any token you will not get the values and the request will fail. So as you can see, we can just do the /favorite, or you can see the URL address here, so we can take it from the example and paste it inside URL. The method will be get because we're trying to access the data inside. Again, we can put a timeout. And now, instead of body, you need to provide it with headers. And inside headers, we want to send the authorization. And we are using the bearer token. So I'm gonna name authorization. And the value inside a string is bearer space token equals, and now the value of the token. Just like this, in this format. And basically what we are doing here is that we are trying to access this API endpoint using get method, which is actually protected by authorization. And we are sending our token in the headers, so this endpoint knows that we are authorized to actually get this data. And again, if we do it, it means that the status response will be 200. So await t.expect. And I have a small mistake somewhere. Yep. Sorry, it should be down here, not inside the response. And we would like to response.status to again equal 200. So let's now try to run the test. And as you can see, our test is passing. So we successfully obtained the data using our authorization token. Again, this is a very common topic because I expect in your company or in your projects, you will have all your endpoints protected by authorization. And using TestCafe, it's again very simple. You will pretty much pass it with the headers inside the request. You will provide it with authorization, your bureau token, and value of your actual token. And now we can do the same, but we will provide it with invalid value, or for example, if we don't even send the authorization at all, our request should fail and we should get status 401, which is unauthorized. So let's try it out. And to actually create a negative authentication scenario, we can just take the positive one and let's copy and paste it, so we don't waste much time actually writing it from scratch. I'm gonna change the description to negative, and I want to show you the differences. In this case, I will actually remove the headers, so I will try to access this API endpoint which is protected, but without sending the token. That means I will not be able to access any data, and I should receive response 401, which means unauthorized. So if I write the command, 401 means unauthorized. That means that you don't have any rights or access tokens to access the data inside this endpoint. So let's try to run it. Again, open terminal. And again, you can see our test is passing. So let me close it. And again, this is a very simple way how you can actually test that your endpoint is securely protected, because if you do not provide it with your access tokens, you should never be able to get data, and you should always get this 401 response, which means you are unauthorized.